I remember the exact sentence because it sounded so calm it almost felt kind. You made your choice, Tige, now live with it, my father said, standing in the doorway like he was discussing the weather instead of his 16-year-old daughter, and I nodded because I had always been polite, always been the one who didn't make scenes, even when my hands were shaking and my suitcase felt heavier than it should have. Like it knew I wasn't coming back. My mother didn't look at me when she zipped it. She just smoothed the fabric like she always did, neat, careful, the same way she folded laundry on Sunday mornings, and I remember thinking how strange it was that everything in that moment looked normal, the porch light, the hallway, the clock on the wall ticking like nothing important was happening, and maybe that was the point, maybe if they made it look small, it wouldn't feel as big as it actually was. I stood there for a second longer than necessary, not waiting for them to change their minds, just giving them time in case they wanted to, and when they didn't, I picked up the suitcase and said, I understand, because I did understand, just not in the way they thought. The door closed behind me with a soft click, not a slam, not dramatic, just final, and the air outside was colder than I expected, or maybe I just wasn't prepared to feel it alone. I adjusted the strap on my shoulder and started walking because standing still felt like agreeing with them, and I had already agreed enough for one night. I didn't cry, not then. I counted my steps instead, 1 block, 2 blocks, 3, like it was something I could measure, something I could control, and somewhere between the 4th and 5th block, I said it out loud, quietly, almost like a promise, I'll be okay, not because I believed it yet, but because it sounded like something a person who survives would say, and that mattered to me. I wasn't loud, I wasn't dramatic, I was just persistent, the kind of person who keeps going even when there's nowhere obvious to go. And that night, with a suitcase in one hand and a future I didn't recognize yet, I learned something that would follow me for the next 20 years. People will tell you who you are when it's convenient for them, but they don't get to decide who you become, and I didn't turn back, not once, because some doors don't need to be slammed to be closed, sometimes they close quietly, politely, with a sentence that sounds reasonable. And a girl who says I understand even when what she really means is I won't forget. I knocked on my grandmother's door at 9:12 p.m. I remember the time because I checked my phone twice before I raised my hand, like confirming the moment would make it easier to step into it. The porch light flickered on before I could knock a second time, and when the door opened, she did not ask why I was there. She did not ask what happened. She looked at my face, then at the suitcase, then at the space between my words that I had not said yet, and she stepped aside and said, Come in, Tige. Just like that, like I had always belonged there. And I walked in without explaining anything because sometimes being invited in is enough to keep you from falling apart. She handed me a towel, thick and warm, the kind she kept folded on the second shelf, and I stood there holding it for a second before I realized my hands were shaking more than I thought. She did not comment on it. She just moved to the kitchen and put water on to boil. The kettle, the same one she had used for years. Soft whistle, steady, predictable, and that sound filled the room in a way silence could not. I sat at the kitchen table and placed the suitcase beside my chair like it might leave if I did not keep it close. She came back with a mug, set it in front of me, and said, Drink this first, then we will talk. And I nodded because it was easier to follow instructions than to explain how I had ended up outside with nowhere to go. When I finally spoke, my voice was smaller than I expected. I cannot go back, I said, and she nodded once, not surprised, not disappointed, just understanding. Then you will stay, she replied, simple, like she was stating a fact that had already been decided, and something in my chest loosened in a way I did not trust yet, like relief was a language I had forgotten how to speak. That night I slept in the small room at the back of her house, the one with the narrow bed and the window that faced the street. I lay there awake longer than I should have, listening to the quiet, real quiet, not the kind that hides tension, but the kind that lets you breathe, and I realized no one was going to come looking for me. No one was going to knock on that door and say they made a mistake, and I did not cry about that either. I just turned onto my side and said it again, softer this time, I will be okay. And over the next few weeks, okay became a routine. Mornings started early. I found a part-time job at a diner 2 miles away. I walked there before sunrise, worked a 6-hour shift, came back, rested, then studied whatever I could manage. My grandmother never asked me for details I was not ready to give. She did not treat me like a problem to solve. She treated me like a person who needed time, and that changed everything. One afternoon, she placed a small notebook in front of me and said, "Write down what you want, not what they expect." And I looked at the page for a long time before writing a single word, future. It looked too big on paper, but I kept it there, underlined once, and from that day forward, everything I did pointed toward that word, not quickly, not perfectly, but consistently. I worked more hours, saved what I could, learned to measure progress in small things, a completed shift, a passed test, a quiet night where I did not feel like I was falling behind, and sometimes, late at night, I would sit at the kitchen table with my books open and the same kettle humming in the background, and I would think about the sentence my father said, "You made your choice," and I would answer it quietly, "Yes, I did," not as defiance, not as anger, but as acceptance, because if that was my choice, then everything that came after was mine too, and for the first time, that felt like something I could build on. I learned to measure my life in hours because days felt too big to manage. 6 hours at the diner, 2 hours of rest, 4 hours of studying, repeat, 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 and somewhere in between I became someone people relied on without ever really seeing. "You were always on time, Tige," my manager said one morning as I tied my apron, and I smiled because being on time was the one thing no one could take from me. Not anymore. I carried plates, refilled coffee, memorized orders, and listened. People talk more than they realize when they think you are just passing by, and I noticed everything, the way voices change when they lie, the way eyes move when they are uncertain, patterns, small things, details that did not seem important until they were. I did not know it yet, but I was training for something bigger than a diner floor. At night I sat at the kitchen table with my grandmother's lamp casting that same soft yellow circle on the wood, books open, pen moving, stopping, moving again, and sometimes I would pause and press my hand against the page like I needed to hold the moment still. My grandmother would pass behind me, quiet, steady, placing a cup of tea beside my elbow without interrupting. She never asked if I was tired, she already knew. One evening she sat across from me and said, "You notice things other people miss," and I looked up, surprised. "That is not a burden, Tige, that is a skill." I nodded, not fully understanding yet, but storing the sentence away like something I would need later. Months passed, then a year, and I built something that looked small from the outside but felt solid from where I stood, a routine, a direction, a life that did not depend on anyone changing their mind. And then one afternoon, a letter arrived, plain envelope, my name written in handwriting I recognized immediately. I held it for a long time before opening it, like the weight of it might change if I waited long enough. Inside was a single sheet, no greeting, no apology, just a short message from my father. "We hope you are doing well. Your mother thought it would be appropriate to check in. Focus on making responsible decisions." That is all. I read it twice, then a third time, searching for something that was not there, something softer, something human, but it stayed exactly the same, clean, distant, controlled. I folded it carefully and placed it in the notebook my grandmother had given me, between the page that said future and the blank page that followed, not as a reminder of pain, but as a record of clarity. That night at dinner my grandmother noticed I was quieter than usual. She did not ask what the letter said. She just looked at me and said, "Some people believe distance protects them." I tilted my head slightly. "From what?" I asked, and she smiled gently, "From seeing themselves clearly." I let that sit for a moment, then I nodded. "I think I understand," I said, and I did, not completely, but enough to know that I did not need to respond. I did not need to explain my life to people who had already decided its value. Instead, I went back to the table, opened my books, and continued, not faster, not harder, just consistent, because consistency builds something stronger than emotion ever could, and over time, that consistency turned into progress. Classes completed, exams passed, doors opened quietly one after another, and every now and then, someone would look at me a little longer than expected, like they were trying to place me, not because they knew me, but because they sensed something, and I would smile politely and keep walking, because I was not building a life to be recognized, I was building a life that could stand on its own, and for the first time, that felt enough. Law school did not feel like a dream coming true, it felt like a test I had already been studying for without realizing it. The first day I walked into that lecture hall, I chose a seat near the middle. Not too visible, not hidden either, just enough to observe. The professor spoke for 10 minutes before asking a question no one answered. Silence filled the room, heavy, uncertain, and then he looked directly at me. "Miss Monroe, what do you think?" And I felt every eye turn, not hostile, just curious, measuring. I placed my pen down carefully and said, "I think the question is not what happened, but who benefits from how it is being explained." The room stayed quiet for a second longer than necessary. Then he nodded slowly. "That is a precise way to look at it," and I understood something in that moment. I was not behind. I had just taken a different path to get here, one that taught me how to read people before I ever read a case. My days became longer, classes, study groups, late nights at the library, and still, I kept my rhythm. I worked weekends, saved money, sent part of it home to my grandmother even when she told me not to. "I am fine, Tige," she would say, and I would smile. "I know. But I am better when I do." We did not argue about it, we just continued, steady, respectful, balanced. And then one afternoon during my second year, I was assigned to assist in a small legal clinic. Basic cases, paperwork, consultations, nothing dramatic, but real enough to matter. I sat across from people who spoke in fragments, who did not know how to explain their own situations, and I listened. The same way I listened at the diner, patient, attentive, letting silence do part of the work. One client looked at me after I summarized her situation and said, "You make it sound clear," and I replied gently, "It already was, you just needed someone to say it out loud." She smiled in a way that told me clarity was not a small gift, it was everything. Weeks later, my supervising attorney handed me a file and said, "Read this carefully, something does not add up." I opened it, scanned the numbers, the timeline, the statements, and I felt that familiar pattern forming, the small details, the inconsistencies, the spaces between what was said and what was avoided. I pointed to one section and said, "This part contradicts the rest." He leaned over, read it again, and then looked at me differently, not as a student, but as someone useful. "Good catch," he said quietly, and from that moment on, he gave me more responsibility, more files, more trust, not loudly, not announced, just gradually, the way real recognition happens. And through it all, I never forgot the kitchen table, the kettle, the notebook with one word written at the top, future. I still kept it, tucked between my casebooks, a reminder that this was not accidental, this was built, one choice at a time, 1 hour at a time. And sometimes, late at night in the library, when the building was almost empty and the lights hummed softly above me, I would pause and think about the letter my father sent, the one with no apology, no warmth, just instruction, and I would respond the same way I always did, not out loud, not angrily, just with quiet certainty. "I am making responsible decisions," and then I would turn the page and continue, because I had learned something they had not expected. Distance does not weaken you when you use it correctly, it sharpens you, it teaches you where you end and where others begin. And by the time I graduated, I was no longer the girl standing outside a closed door. I was someone who knew exactly which doors to open, and more importantly, when to walk away from the ones that should stay closed. The first time someone called me counselor, I almost turned around to see who they were talking to. The word did not feel like it belonged to me yet, not after everything it took to get there, but I nodded politely and said, "Good morning," because I had learned that sometimes you grow into a title by wearing it quietly before you fully believe it. My days became structured in a different way, courtrooms instead of classrooms, files instead of textbooks, but the rhythm stayed the same. Observe, listen, wait, then speak, always in that order. My supervisor once told me, "You do not rush your words, that makes people listen when you finally say them," and I smiled slightly. "I learned that early," I replied, leaving out the part about silence being the only safe option for a long time. I handled smaller cases at first, nothing that made headlines, but every case mattered to someone, and I treated them that way, carefully, respectfully, because I knew what it felt like to not be taken seriously. One afternoon, I was reviewing a file that had been passed over twice, labeled as routine, but something in it felt unfinished. The timeline was clean, the statements were consistent, too consistent. I leaned back in my chair and read it again, slower this time, and then I saw it, not in what was written, but in what was missing. I walked into my supervisor's office and placed the file on his desk. "There is a gap here," I said calmly. He glanced at it and replied, "It has already been reviewed." I nodded once, yes, but not closely enough. He looked at me for a moment, then opened the file again, silence filled the room, the kind that stretches just long enough to matter, and then he exhaled slowly. "You are right," he said, and just like that, the case shifted, more attention, more scrutiny, more weight, and I felt that familiar pattern again, small details. Quiet observations, leading to something larger, something that could not be ignored. Later that evening, I sat at my kitchen table, the same notebook open in front of me, though the pages were no longer blank, filled now with notes, thoughts, fragments of cases and reflections. My grandmother sat across from me, her hands wrapped around her mug. "You look different," she said gently. I tilted my head slightly. "Different how?" She smiled. "Like you know where you are going." I considered that for a moment before answering. "I think I always did. I just did not know what it would look like." She nodded, satisfied with that answer. We did not need more words. We rarely did. A few weeks later, I received a formal assignment, my first major case as lead. I read the file carefully, once, twice, 3 times, and then I paused, not because I was unsure, but because I recognized something in it, not the details, not the names, but the structure, the way information was presented, controlled, selective, familiar. It reminded me of the letter, the one that said just enough to sound reasonable but left out everything that mattered. I closed the file slowly and said to myself, "We will take our time with this," not out of hesitation, but intention, because I had learned that truth does not respond well to pressure, it responds to patience. And as I prepared for court, organizing notes, building arguments, I felt something settle into place, not excitement, not fear, just clarity, the kind that comes when you realize you are exactly where you need to be, doing exactly what you were built to do. And somewhere in the back of my mind, a quiet thought surfaced, not loud enough to distract me, but clear enough to stay. One day, the past will walk into this room, and when it does, I will not need to raise my voice, I will not need to explain myself, I will simply stand where I am, and let everything else reveal itself. The file was thicker than most, not because of complexity, but because of history, the kind that builds slowly over years and then arrives all at once in a single folder placed on your desk without ceremony. I opened it at 7:40 a.m. with a cup of coffee that had already gone cold. The names meant nothing at first, just lines on paper, signatures, dates, transactions, but something about the structure felt familiar, too clean in some places, too vague in others, like someone had tried to tell a complete story while quietly removing the parts that mattered. I read it once without interruption, then again with a pen in my hand, marking small inconsistencies, a date that did not align, a statement that answered a question no one had asked. A pattern began to form, not loud, not obvious, but steady. I leaned back in my chair and said quietly, "There you are," not to anyone in the room, just to the truth starting to show itself. Later that morning, I stepped into the conference room where the defense team was already seated. Their lead attorney stood to greet me, polite, professional, the kind of smile that suggests confidence without revealing anything. "Good morning," he said, extending his hand, and I returned the gesture. "Good morning," I replied, matching his tone exactly, not warmer, not colder, just precise. We sat, exchanged initial remarks, discussed timelines, expectations, the usual structure that gives people the illusion of control, and then he said something that caught my attention, not the words themselves, but the way he said them. "We believe this matter can be resolved efficiently." I nodded slightly. "Efficiency depends on clarity," I answered, and his smile shifted, just a fraction, enough to confirm what I had already suspected. They were hoping I would move quickly, accept the surface, not look too closely. I made a note without writing it down, slow this down, not out of resistance, but accuracy. Over the next few days, I reviewed additional documents, requested clarifications, asked questions that seemed simple but were not, and each time, the responses came back just a little too polished, like they had been prepared for someone who would not ask follow-up questions. One evening, as I sat at my kitchen table with the file spread out in front of me, my grandmother walked in quietly and placed a fresh cup of tea beside me. I did not look up immediately. I was tracing a timeline with my finger, connecting events that had been intentionally separated. "You found something," she said gently, not a question. I nodded once. "They left a space," I replied, "and they hoped no one would notice." She smiled softly. "But you always notice." I paused for a moment, then said, "I learned from good teachers." She did not respond to that. She did not need to. The next morning, I requested a formal hearing, not rushed, not delayed, just properly scheduled, and when the notice went out, I saw the first real shift from the other side, a change in tone, in urgency, in the way they communicated, not panic, but awareness. They understood now that this would not be handled quietly, that someone was paying attention, and as I prepared my notes for the hearing, organizing each detail with care, I felt that same calm certainty settle in again, not excitement, not satisfaction, just readiness. Because this was not about winning, it was about seeing clearly, and making sure everyone else had to see it too. And somewhere in the middle of that preparation, a thought crossed my mind, simple, steady, almost quiet enough to miss. Some stories take years to circle back to you, and when they do not arrive loudly, they sit across from you, well-dressed, carefully prepared, and they wait to see if you recognize them. I closed the file slowly and said under my breath, I do. The morning of the hearing arrived without urgency, which is how I knew it mattered. The calendar notification appeared at 8 a.m., the same quiet reminder as any other day, but the file on my desk carried a different weight now, not heavier, just clearer. I reviewed my notes one more time, not to memorize them, but to confirm what I already understood, the timeline, the gaps, the pattern that had been hidden in plain sight. I closed the folder gently and said to myself, we will keep this simple, because simple is harder to argue with. The courtroom was already half full when I walked in, low voices, papers shifting, the soft echo of footsteps against polished floors. I took my place without looking around too much, not out of avoidance, but focus, and then the defense entered, their attorney first. Composed, measured, followed by two figures I did not recognize immediately, not because they had changed, but because time had placed distance between who they were and who I had become. My eyes moved past them at first, naturally, professionally, until something in the way they stood caught my attention, a familiarity in posture. In silence, I paused, just for a fraction of a second, then continued organizing my papers as if nothing had shifted, because nothing needed to shift yet. The judge entered, the room stood, sat, and the proceedings began. Introductions were made, formal, precise, and when it was my turn, I stood and said, "Good morning, Your Honor," my voice steady, clear, exactly as it had been trained to be, not louder, not softer, just controlled. The defense attorney followed, and then came the moment that rearranged the room without anyone realizing it. He turned slightly, gestured behind him, and said, "My clients are present today," and I looked up, properly this time, directly, and there they were, my father and my mother, seated side by side, dressed carefully, as they always had been, composed in the way people are when they believe they understand the situation they are in. My mother's hands were folded in her lap, my father's shoulders straight, both of them looking forward, not at me, not yet, and I felt something settle inside me, not shock, not anger, just recognition, quiet and complete, like finding a missing piece exactly where it should be. I did not react, I did not pause longer than necessary, I simply nodded once, a professional acknowledgement, and continued, because this was not the moment for personal history, this was the moment for clarity. The defense began their opening remarks, structured, confident, outlining their version of events with careful language, and I listened the way I always do, not just to the words, but to the spaces between them, and in those spaces, I heard it again. The same tone as the letter, measured, controlled, reasonable on the surface, incomplete underneath. I made a small note on the margin of my file, not words, just a mark, a reminder of where to return later, and when it was my turn, I stood again, placed my hands lightly on the table, and began, "Your Honor, this case is not complicated, but it has been presented that way." I paused briefly, not for effect, but for accuracy. What we are looking at is not a misunderstanding. It is a pattern. I did not raise my voice, I did not rush, I laid out each point clearly, one by one, the timeline, the inconsistencies, the omissions, each detail placed exactly where it belonged, and as I spoke, I felt it, the shift in the room, subtle, almost invisible, attention sharpening, assumptions adjusting, and somewhere behind me, I heard a small movement, a breath caught, a chair shifting slightly, but I did not turn around, not yet. Because I had learned something important, timing matters more than emotion, and this was not the moment to look back, this was the moment to move forward, and so I continued, steady, precise, letting the truth do what it always does when given enough space, reveal itself, piece by piece, until there is nothing left to hide. The room did not react all at once, it never does, it shifts in small ways first. A pen stops moving, a chair creaks, someone looks up a second earlier than they intended, and I watched those details the same way I always had, not because I needed confirmation, but because patterns tell you when the truth is landing. I moved through the timeline slowly, deliberately, not skipping steps, not assuming agreement. This entry, I said, pointing to a document already submitted, appears consistent. Until you place it next to this one. I lifted another page, held it just long enough for the judge to see, then placed it down again. The dates align, but the intent does not. The defense attorney shifted slightly, subtle, but enough. He adjusted his glasses, glanced at his notes, then back at me. Counselor, that is an interpretation, he said, calm, measured, and I nodded once. Yes, I replied, which is why we follow it with evidence. I did not raise my voice, I did not rush, I let each word sit exactly where it needed to be, because pressure comes from clarity, not volume. I introduced the next piece, then the next, each one small on its own, but together forming something that could not be easily dismissed, and as I spoke, I felt it again, that quiet alignment, the moment when everything you have prepared meets the exact situation it was meant for. I paused briefly, then said, there is a gap here, the same sentence I had used before, but now it carried more weight, because everyone in the room could see it, not just me. The judge leaned forward slightly, reviewing the documents again, slower this time. The defense attorney opened his mouth, then closed it, reconsidering, and somewhere behind him, I heard it, a soft inhale, controlled, but not entirely. I did not need to turn to know who it came from. I continued, this case has been presented as a series of isolated events, I said, my tone even, respectful, but when viewed in sequence, it becomes something else entirely. I let that sit for a moment, not for drama, but for accuracy, because the difference between those two perspectives was the entire case. The defense attempted to redirect, shifting focus, introducing alternative explanations, but each time, I returned to the same point, not aggressively, not defensively, just consistently. We are not discussing possibilities, I said at one point, we are looking at what is supported, and that was enough, because supported facts do not require embellishment, they stand on their own. And as the hearing moved forward, the room grew quieter, not tense, not uncomfortable, just attentive, the kind of silence that means people are recalibrating what they thought they understood. I closed the final section of my argument with a simple statement, clarity is not complicated, it is just often delayed, and I stepped back, allowing the space to hold that for a moment. The judge nodded slowly, making notes. The defense sat still, reviewing, adjusting, and then, for the first time since the hearing began, I turned, not abruptly, not dramatically, just enough to acknowledge what had always been there. My mother's eyes met mine first, wide, searching, like she was trying to reconcile two versions of me that no longer matched. My father looked at me a second later, his expression controlled, but not unchanged. There was something else there now, something quieter, less certain. I held their gaze for exactly 1 second, no more, no less, and then I inclined my head slightly, polite, respectful, the same way I would acknowledge anyone in that room, because this was not about proving something to them, it never had been. And as I turned back to the table, I felt it settle, not victory, not closure, just a shift, the kind that happens when the truth is no longer optional, and whatever came next, it would not be built on misunderstanding, it would be built on what was finally, clearly seen. The judge did not speak immediately, and that silence carried more weight than any verdict announced too quickly. He reviewed the documents again, slower now, not because he needed more time, but because the clarity demanded it, and when he finally looked up, his voice was calm, measured. The court finds that the presented sequence of events supports the prosecution's position. There was no dramatic pause, no raised tone, just a statement placed exactly where it belonged, and that was enough. The room shifted again, not loudly, but completely. The defense attorney nodded once, professional, accepting, already adjusting to what came next, and I closed my file with the same care I had opened it, not rushed, not delayed, just finished, because that is what this was, not an ending, just a conclusion of what had already been clear. As people began to stand, gather their papers, move toward the doors, I remained seated for a moment longer, letting the room return to its usual rhythm, and then I stood, smoothing the edge of my folder, preparing to leave the same way I had entered, without unnecessary attention, but as I turned, I saw them already waiting, not in my path, not blocking my way, just there. My mother stepped forward first, her hands no longer folded, her composure still present but softer now. "Tige," she said, my name careful on her tongue, like it required permission. I inclined my head slightly. "Good afternoon," I replied, polite, even, the same tone I had used in court. Because respect does not change depending on who you are speaking to, it reflects who you are. My father stood just behind her, his posture still straight, but his certainty less rigid. He looked at me directly this time, no distance, no avoidance, just a quiet recognition that had not been there before. "You have done well," he said, the words simple, almost formal, but different from anything he had said to me in the past. I held his gaze for a moment, then answered, "I have done what was necessary," not sharp, not defensive, just true. There was a pause. Not uncomfortable, just unfamiliar, like we were all standing in a space none of us had practiced for. My mother's eyes moved slightly, taking in details she had not seen before, my posture, my expression, the way I held myself. "We did not know," she began, and then stopped, because the sentence did not have a clean ending. I nodded once, gently. "I understand," I said, the same words I had used years ago, but they carried something different now, not surrender, not quiet acceptance, but clarity, because understanding does not mean agreement, it means you see things as they are. My father exhaled slowly, a small shift, but enough. "We thought we were making the right decision," he said, and I considered that for a moment before replying. "Sometimes people do what feels right in the moment," I said calmly, "and spend years learning what it actually meant." I did not accuse, I did not revisit the past. I placed the truth in front of us the same way I had in court, clear, structured, without excess. My mother's voice softened further. "Is there a way?" She started, then paused, searching for the right words, and I finished the sentence for her, not unkindly. "To move forward," she nodded, and I allowed a small smile, not wide, not dramatic, just enough to be seen. "There is always a way forward," I said, "but it starts with seeing clearly." They both nodded, slowly, not because they had rehearsed it, but because they understood it, finally, and in that moment, there was no victory, no defeat, just a quiet shift in how we stood across from each other, not as people defined by one decision, but as people who had lived long enough to understand its weight. I adjusted the folder in my hand, preparing to leave, and before I stepped away, I said one last thing, not loudly, not for effect, just because it belonged there. "I kept going," I said, meeting their eyes briefly, "and I did not forget." I paused, just long enough for it to settle, then added, softer, "But I also did not stop," and with that, I turned and walked toward the door, not looking back, not because I needed distance, but because I had already carried the past as far as it needed to go, and the rest of my life was waiting on the other side, steady, clear, and entirely my own.